Tokyo, November 24, 1944. The morning sky was calm, pale blue above the sprawling wooden maze of the world's largest city. Children walked to school. Housewives carried buckets to collect water from wells. Above them, the sound of sirens began to rise, low at first, then urgent, echoing between the narrow streets. Japanese spotters along the coast had seen them first, faint, silver shapes moving slowly across the upper atmosphere. So high that even binoculars showed little more than glints of light. Just a few slow bombers, a pilot joked from the airfield below. They'll never make it back once our fighters climb. But the fighters never reached them. The Zeros stalled in the thin air. The flak bursts fell short. The silver shapes kept coming, steady, deliberate, indifferent. And then the city trembled. Bombs fell from altitude so high the defenders couldn't even hear the planes that dropped them. Flames erupted across the docks and rail yards. The Superfortress, as the Americans called it, the Boeing B-29, had arrived. That day, Tokyo learned what it meant to be beneath the shadow of the slowest, highest, and most unstoppable machine of the war. By late 1943, the Pacific Ocean had become a graveyard of ambitions. Japan's empire, once stretched from the jungles of Burma to the shores of Hawaii, was shrinking. Island by island, the United States had begun to claw its way back across the Pacific. Guadalcanal had fallen. Tarawa had been taken at terrible cost. And behind each advance came something larger, quieter, and far more patient, American industry. While Japan struggled to replace a single lost carrier or plane, the United States built thousands each month. New airfields, new ships, new weapons, all rising from an industrial rhythm that seemed impossible to stop. Among those creations was something so vast and complex it was almost mythical, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. It was unlike any aircraft ever built. Pressurized cabins allowed crews to fly higher than 30,000 feet, where the air was too thin for most fighters to follow. Remote-controlled gun turrets gave it defenses in every direction. And four massive Wright RT-3350 engines could push it farther than any bomber in history. It wasn't just a new plane, it was a flying factory, a 32-ton symbol of technological dominance. The project cost nearly $3 billion, second only to the Manhattan Project itself. Every bolt, every rivet, was a declaration that the war would now be fought not only with courage, but with mathematics and metal. The Japanese intelligence services first heard rumors of it in early 1944. They dismissed it as exaggerated American propaganda, another boast from an enemy with too much money and too many machines. But soon, they began to see the silver contrails high above the clouds, and they knew the rumors were real. In the spring of 1944, the first B-29s began operations from China under a plan called Operation Matterhorn. From remote bases near Chengdu, they would bomb Japan's industrial centers, a logistical nightmare that required supplies to be flown over the hump, across the Himalayas, one of the most dangerous air routes in the world. For every single bomb dropped on Japan, 12 tons of fuel, food, and parts had to be carried across the mountains by transport aircraft. The B-29 crews called it the longest supply line in history. And yet, despite the effort, those early missions were disappointing. Many bombs missed their targets. Engines overheated. Weather and high-altitude winds scattered formations. Still, something important had changed. Japan now knew that its mainland, the sacred home islands, was no longer untouchable. By mid-1944, the Americans solved their greatest problem, distance. When U.S. Marines captured the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, they created a forward base close enough to Japan for the B-29 to strike directly, without relying on China. Tinian alone would become the largest airbase on Earth, 6,000 men, 500 bombers, and runways long enough to launch an invasion of the sky itself. Japanese scouts flying along the Pacific saw the construction and radioed back grimly, "The Americans are building airfields larger than cities." They were right. And from those runways, the slow giants of the sky would soon rise in formation, hundreds of them at once, glinting silver in the morning sun, their wings casting shadows over the Pacific. The Japanese Air Force, the once proud Imperial Army Air Service, was already showing cracks. Its pilots were brave, but inexperienced. Its fighters were agile, but fragile. Against the thin air and long reach of the B-29, they could do little but watch. In Tokyo, commanders believed the Americans were bluffing, that no bomber could survive such long missions or such heights. They laughed at the idea of a superfortress. But far to the east, at dawn, engines were already starting on Tinian. Rows of bombers stood lined across the coral runways, propellers spinning, their polished fuselages reflecting the rising sun. Each one carried thousands of pounds of explosives. Each one carried the promise of fire. The war for the skies over Japan was about to begin. By the end of 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces had achieved what no other nation in history had done. They had built a bomber that could reach Japan, bomb it, and return, all from bases thousands of miles away. The B-29 Superfortress was the new face of American air power, sleek, high-flying, and relentlessly efficient. But its early missions showed one harsh truth: even the most advanced machine in the world was powerless without the right strategy. When the first waves of B-29s thundered over Japan in late 1944, their targets were military factories, steelworks, and aircraft plants, all chosen by high-altitude reconnaissance. The plan was to cripple Japan's war industry through precision bombing. But Japan's geography betrayed them. The islands were shrouded in clouds, wind, and unpredictable jet streams. Crews flying at 30,000 feet found themselves tossed violently in the air, their bomb sights useless. Bombs drifted for miles off target, hitting farmland instead of foundries. A single mission could lose dozens of aircraft, not to enemy fighters, but to mechanical failure, weather, or fuel exhaustion. The mighty Superfortress suddenly seemed fragile, trapped in the sky between ambition and reality. Inside the cockpits, the tension was constant. Pilots wore oxygen masks, frost forming on the edges. Gunners watched the radar scopes for enemy aircraft, their fingers trembling from the cold. Some missions lasted 16 hours or more, long stretches of silence, punctuated by the hum of 4 massive engines. When they finally approached Japan, anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black puffs of flak. The Japanese called them Baka no Kyodai Hikoki, the stupid giant airplanes. They mocked their slowness, their size, their arrogance. But even as they laughed, they watched the bombs fall, small black dots tumbling through the gray sky. The laughter would not last. By late November 1944, Major General Curtis LeMay took command of the XXI Bomber Command. He was blunt, ruthless, and obsessed with efficiency. LeMay had studied the failures of high-altitude bombing and reached a cold conclusion: Japan's wooden cities could not be defeated by precision. They could only be destroyed by fire. So he changed everything. He ordered the bombers to fly at night, at low altitude, and to carry incendiary bombs, napalm-filled canisters designed to ignite entire city blocks. The new tactic was dangerous. Flying low meant losing altitude advantage, making them easy targets for flak and fighters. But it also meant accuracy. And for Japan's paper and wood cities, accuracy would mean annihilation. LeMay's men called him Iron Ass, but even those who hated him admitted, he knew how to win a war from the sky. The first test came on March 9, 1945. The target, Tokyo, the beating heart of Japan, home to over 6 million people. At 10:30 p.m., the first formations took off from Tinian. Each aircraft carried M69 incendiaries, clustered to burst midair and scatter burning gel across vast areas. Their bomb bays were stripped of heavy armor and guns to make room for more payload. As they flew toward Japan, one crew member reportedly said, "Tonight, we burn a city." By midnight, radar operators in Tokyo began to see them, hundreds of dots approaching from the southeast. The air raid sirens screamed. Searchlights swept the sky. And then the first bombs began to fall. Within minutes, fires erupted across the eastern districts. Winds turned them into firestorms. Entire neighborhoods disappeared under seas of flame. The heat was so intense it melted asphalt, boiled rivers, and stripped oxygen from the air. The B-29s flew through black columns of smoke that rose 30,000 feet high, higher than they were flying. From above, Tokyo looked like a single, glowing wound. When dawn came, over 100,000 people were dead. 16 square miles of the capital were gone, more destruction than any single air raid in history. The Japanese pilots who once mocked the B-29 now stood on their runways, staring at a horizon that glowed red even after sunrise. The slow American bomber had just erased their capital in a single night. And for General LeMay, it was only the beginning. Because the next cities on his list, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, were already being loaded into the bomb bays. The empire had awakened to a new kind of war, one where the sky itself became a weapon. The B-29 wasn't just another aircraft. It was a machine that changed the nature of air warfare, a weapon that fused engineering, psychology, and strategy into one unstoppable force. To understand its impact, we must look at it from multiple angles, each revealing a different face of the same terrifying truth. Wrench the technological angle, the sky giant that shouldn't have existed. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was unlike anything that had ever taken to the skies. When it first flew in 1942, it was the most expensive weapon project in history, even more costly than the Manhattan Project at that stage. Each aircraft carried over 350,000 parts, required 60,000 man-hours to build, and cost about $639,000, a fortune by wartime standards. It was built to do the impossible, fly higher, faster, and farther than any bomber before it. With a pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and supercharged engines, it could climb to altitudes above 30,000 feet, far beyond the reach of most enemy fighters. Its four Wright R-3350 engines produced a combined 8,800 horsepower, enough to carry 20,000 pounds of bombs across 3,000 miles, a distance so great it made transoceanic bombing possible for the first time in history. From the ground, Japanese civilians often described the B-29s as silver whales in the sky, slow-moving, yet impossibly high, their engines humming like thunder behind the clouds. For Japan, they were ghosts, appearing suddenly, destroying everything, then vanishing into the night. But behind that technological perfection lay endless suffering. Overheating engines, fuel leaks, and mechanical failures claimed hundreds of aircraft before they ever reached combat. The Superfortress was powerful, yes, but it was also merciless to those who flew it. Compass the strategic angle, a new kind of war before the B-29, the US had no realistic way to bomb Japan directly. Aircraft from China-based bases under Operation Matterhorn faced impossible logistics, hauling fuel and bombs across the Himalayas just to launch a few missions. The capture of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, in mid-1944 changed everything. Suddenly, American bombers were just 1,500 miles from Tokyo. Airfields the size of small cities were carved from coral and jungle, runways stretching 2 miles long, with underground fuel systems and maintenance hangars for hundreds of planes. From these islands, LeMay could strike anywhere in Japan. No front lines, no soldiers to capture, just the enemy's cities, industries, and will to fight. The B-29 campaign wasn't just about destroying factories, it was about breaking Japan's capacity to sustain modern war. Every drop of fuel, every ton of steel, every rifle, all depended on urban workshops. LeMay turned this logic into strategy: destroy the city, and you destroy the war machine. It was industrial warfare in its purest, coldest form, a battle fought with altitude and fire, not with bayonets or tanks. Military metal: the human angle, life inside the Superfortress for the 10 men aboard each B-29, missions were a mix of exhaustion and terror. They were young, most in their early 20s, yet carried responsibility for millions of dollars in machinery and thousands of lives below. Each flight was a test of endurance. The temperature inside the unheated tail sections could drop to -40 degrees Celsius. Crews wore heated suits plugged into the plane's power system, but if the wiring failed, frostbite set in within minutes. When flak bursts hit, the aircraft shook violently, filling with the smell of burning insulation. The intercom would crackle with clipped voices, calm, controlled, hiding the fear underneath. Each man had a job, each second mattered. And yet, there was no glory. Unlike fighter pilots, they saw no faces, only cities seen from miles above. They dropped bombs, then turned home in silence, knowing that below, entire neighborhoods had just vanished. Some carried guilt for years. Others buried it under duty. But all of them knew one thing: if they didn't finish the job, the war would drag on, and more would die. That cold logic became their armor. Fire the enemy's angle. The laughing pilots' Japanese fighter aces had mocked the B-29s early on. At high altitude, they seemed slow and predictable, perfect targets for the agile Mitsubishi Ki-84, Frank, or the twin-engine Ki-45. But when they tried to engage, they realized the truth: those bombers flew too high, and their defensive fire was lethal. Each B-29 carried 12.50 caliber Browning machine guns, guided by an analog computer system, a revolutionary design that allowed gunners to track targets automatically. The Japanese soon learned that one mistake meant death. They began calling the bombers flying fortresses of flame. Even the kamikaze pilots, those willing to die, hesitated when facing B-29 formations. The bombers flew in tight boxes, each plane protecting the others. To reach one meant flying through a wall of tracers and steel. Soon, Japanese Air Command admitted that intercepting the B-29s was nearly impossible. Fuel shortages and lack of experienced pilots only deepened the despair. For Japan's once proud Air Force, the skies above the homeland had become a graveyard. From technology to terror, from laughter to ashes, every angle revealed one truth: the B-29 was not just an aircraft. It was the embodiment of total war, cold, efficient, and inescapable. And that truth would reach its darkest moment in the next phase, when the flames of Tokyo gave way to something even more devastating. The tactical angle: fire over precision. When Curtis LeMay ordered the shift from daylight precision bombing to low-altitude night fire raids, it was a tactical gamble that defied all conventional air doctrine. Since 1939, the U.S. Army Air Forces had preached the gospel of the Norden bomb sight, the idea that skilled crews could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet. But Japan's weather, wind, and wooden architecture made such precision meaningless. Cloud-scattered formations. Jet streams, unknown at the time, blew bombs miles off course. The bombers returned home empty-handed, or worse, lost in the dark Pacific. LeMay's solution was brutal simplicity: forget accuracy, maximize destruction. He stripped the bombers of excess weight, removed their defensive guns, and ordered them to fly at just 5,000 to 8,000 feet, where the incendiaries could ignite maximum surface area. At that height, Japanese anti-aircraft fire was deadly, but LeMay reasoned the darkness would protect them. He was right. The first few raids proved catastrophic for Japan's cities, and shockingly effective for the Americans. Within weeks, Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka were engulfed in fire. The Japanese defenses, designed for high-altitude interception, were useless against this new method. The very thing they had mocked, the slow B-29, had become an unstoppable predator in the night. Tactically, it was one of the most efficient campaigns in military history. Morally, it was one of the darkest. Cityscape: the civilian angle, life beneath the fire for the people of Tokyo, March 9 to 10, 1945, was not a battle, it was a nightmare from the heavens. When the siren sounded, many believed it was another routine alert. But this time, the sky didn't rumble with scattered engines, it roared with hundreds. The first incendiaries fell in the densely packed district of Shitamachi. Within minutes, paper walls ignited, tatami mats exploded into flames, and narrow alleys turned into tunnels of fire. The wind grew stronger, fanning embers into tornadoes that leapt across the Sumida River. People fled into canals and ponds to escape the heat, only to suffocate as the flames consumed all oxygen. Firefighters were powerless. Their hoses melted, their pumps seized. By dawn, the firestorm had consumed over 16 square miles, nearly 1/4 of the city. Those who survived described the sound of the fire as a living thing, a roar that drowned out human screams. Tokyo was not destroyed by bombs, it was erased by air. Across Japan, word spread quickly. In Nagoya, in Osaka, in Kobe, civilians dug shelters, prayed, and waited. They knew the Americans were coming again, and nothing on earth could stop them. Balance scale the moral angle, the price of victory. Even within the American command, there was unease. Some officers questioned whether firebombing cities, filled with civilians, crossed the line between warfare and massacre. But LeMay's answer was simple: if you kill enough of them, they stop fighting. He saw his job as shortening the war, no matter the method. Every city burned, he argued, meant fewer U.S. soldiers dying on future beaches. For him, morality ended where victory began. But for the men who dropped the bombs, the questions lingered. Crews watched entire neighborhoods vanish through their periscopes. Some refused to look, others stared in silence, their faces lit by the glow below. After the war, LeMay admitted that had the Allies lost, he would likely have been tried as a war criminal. Yet history wrote his name as a victor, the man who brought Japan to its knees before the atomic bomb ever fell. The line between necessity and atrocity had blurred, and perhaps, for the first time, the world realized that modern war had no boundaries left. Mantelpiece clock: the psychological angle, the shadow that never lifted for the Japanese people. The B-29 became a symbol of inevitable doom. Its distant engines meant death was coming, and there was no escape. Children drew pictures of silver airplanes raining fire, mothers taught their families how to breathe through wet towels when the air burned. Psychologically, it shattered the nation's will. Entire cities vanished without a single enemy soldier landing. Factories moved underground, schools closed, food vanished. The government urged citizens to fight to the last, with bamboo spears if necessary, but deep down, many knew it was hopeless. When you can no longer defend your own sky, the war is already lost. The once proud empire that had laughed at the slow American machines was now haunted by them, shadows crossing the sun. From tactics to trauma, from victory to void, every angle revealed the same transformation. The B-29 had started as a symbol of technological triumph, but by 1945, it had become something far greater, and far darker. Because the next phase of this story would test the limits of destruction itself. Tokyo was gone. But two other cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, still waited beneath the wings of the Superfortress. By the summer of 1945, Japan was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for survival. Its navy lay at the bottom of the Pacific, its air force scattered and starved, its industries crippled by months of relentless bombing. But even in ruin, Tokyo's war cabinet refused to surrender. The Japanese High Command still clung to a belief that if they could make an Allied invasion of the home islands too costly, America might negotiate. That illusion was about to vanish, just like everything else that stood beneath the wings of the B-29. In May, the skies over Japan had changed forever. Where once a few dozen bombers flew cautiously in formation, now hundreds filled the horizon, flying with precision and purpose. The raids had become routine, mechanical, inevitable. Factories, shipyards, and refineries were wiped out one after another. The Superfortress had evolved into an airborne weapon of exhaustion, not just destroying, but draining the enemy of hope. But something new was being prepared, something that even the hardened crews of the B-29 could hardly comprehend. At a remote airfield on Tinian, a single bomber sat under heavy guard. Its name was Enola Gay. The mission brief was unlike anything before it. No formation. No escorts. No incendiaries. Just one bomb, a weapon born from years of secret research, hidden under the codename Manhattan Project. The bomb itself was called Little Boy. It weighed nearly 9,000 pounds and used uranium-235, a material so rare that the entire U.S. output barely produced enough for a single device. To the airmen, it was another mission, long hours, precise flight paths, and absolute secrecy. But to the scientists and generals watching from afar, it was a test that would decide the course of human history. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945, Colonel Paul W. Tibbets Jr. lifted the Enola Gay off the runway. The night was still, the engine steady. As they climbed into the blackness, the other crew members stayed silent, each aware that this flight was unlike any other. 7 hours later, they reached the southern coast of Japan. The target, Hiroshima, an industrial city of over 300,000 people, home to army headquarters and supply depots. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. The bomb dropped, slow, silent, spinning toward the earth. It fell for 43 seconds. Then, a blinding flash turned night into day. In that instant, Hiroshima ceased to exist. The explosion released the energy of 15,000 tons of TNT, a force so immense that it vaporized everything within a mile of the detonation point. Steel bridges melted. Concrete cracked like glass. People simply vanished, their shadows burned into the walls behind them. The shockwave tore through the city, flattening buildings, uprooting trees, igniting everything that could burn. Those who survived the blast staggered through the ruins, burned, blind, screaming. The air itself was poison. Within minutes, 70,000 were dead. Tens of thousands more would follow in the days ahead. Above the chaos, the Enola Gay banked sharply, the crew staring back at the rising column of smoke and fire. The mushroom cloud climbed higher than any storm, its base churning with flame, its top flattening into a vast, silent crown. No one spoke. Even the most hardened among them understood, the world had just changed forever. In Tokyo, news of the bombing arrived slowly, at first dismissed as another fire raid, then confirmed by stunned military observers. They had no words for what they saw. Entire communication lines went dead, reconnaissance planes found nothing left to photograph. Within 24 hours, American intelligence intercepted frantic radio chatter from Japanese command, confusion, disbelief, and, finally, dread. The enemy had unleashed a weapon beyond comprehension. But the war machine kept moving. 3 days later, August 9, 1945, another B-29, boxcar, commanded by Major Charles Sweeney, took off with a second bomb. Its target was Kakura, but heavy clouds forced a change. The alternate target was Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man, a plutonium bomb far more powerful than the first, detonated. In seconds, 40,000 people were dead. The city vanished beneath the same terrible shadow. For the first time in history, mankind had used the power of the atom in war, and twice within 3 days. The Japanese pilots who once mocked the B-29 as slow now stood powerless beneath its roar. They could only watch as entire cities disappeared, not burned, but obliterated. The Superfortress was no longer just a bomber, it was a harbinger of apocalypse. Even Emperor Hirohito, shielded from much of the war's brutality, understood that Japan faced extinction. His generals wanted to continue, to die with honor. But the emperor had seen enough. He ordered surrender preparations to begin. And so, within the space of 1 week, the B-29 had achieved what years of naval blockades and land battles could not, the complete collapse of a nation's will. The bomber that once struggled in the clouds had ended a world war. But as the smoke cleared, and the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki cooled, the question began to haunt both victors and vanquished alike: had humanity crossed a line it could never return from? In the days following Nagasaki, the skies over Japan grew quiet, not because the war was over, but because there was nothing left to destroy. Factories lay in ruins. Rail lines twisted like melted wire. Cities once filled with life were now flat plains of gray ash. The Japanese high command met in dark, smoke-filled rooms, voices raised, faces hollow. Some generals demanded one last stand, to fight the Americans on the beaches, to die rather than surrender. But others, staring at photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, whispered the unthinkable, that the emperor himself must speak, and the war must end. For Japan, this was not a strategic decision. It was an act of survival, and of mercy. The emperor's voice on August 15, 1945, at precisely noon, millions of Japanese citizens gathered around radios in their shattered homes. Static crackled through the air. Then, for the first time in history, they heard the voice of Emperor Hirohito. His tone was calm, almost detached. He spoke in the formal, distant language of the court. But his message was unmistakable: the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We have resolved to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. Those words ended a war that had consumed the world for 6 long years. The man who was once regarded as divine had spoken, and his people obeyed. Even hardened soldiers, who had sworn never to surrender, wept openly. The empire that had laughed at American toy tanks and slow bombers had fallen beneath their fire and steel. Gear Operation Blacklist, the occupation in the weeks that followed, U.S. forces prepared for the unthinkable, an occupation of Japan. Under General Douglas MacArthur, Operation Blacklist began. From the decks of aircraft carriers, waves of transport planes filled with supplies and personnel streamed toward the islands. What they found was not an enemy preparing resistance, but a nation stunned into silence. Cities were gone. Roads were lined with rubble. Children stared at the sky whenever they heard an engine, unsure whether it brought food or death. MacArthur himself landed at Atsugi Airfield on August 30, 1945, escorted by B-29s that circled above like guardians. 2 weeks later, on September 2, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan officially surrendered. Representatives of the Allied powers stood in solemn formation as Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed the document of unconditional surrender. Overhead, a formation of B-29s, 462 of them, roared across the sky, symbolizing the force that had brought the empire to its knees. Their engines echoed like a requiem for the fallen. Factory the aftershock, power beyond war. The end of the war did not end the B-29 story. In fact, its influence had only begun. From the ruins of Japan emerged a new age, one where nations sought to dominate the sky as they once fought for land. The B-29's success inspired an entire generation of strategic bombers, the B-50, B-36 Peacemaker, and ultimately the B-52 Superfortress, which still flies today. It also ignited the Cold War arms race. The Soviet Union, shocked by America's air supremacy, reverse-engineered a captured B-29 into their own 2-4 Bull bomber, a near-perfect replica. The race for nuclear dominance had begun, and the Superfortress was its starting line. What began as a tool to end a world war became the foundation for the next 4 decades of global tension. The age of atomic deterrence had arrived, born from aluminum wings and roaring engines. Scull the human cost, but for all its might, the B-29's victory came with an unbearable cost. In Japan alone, more than 500,000 civilians died in bombing raids, most from fire, some from radiation. Millions more were left homeless. Pilots who returned home as heroes often carried invisible wounds. Many spoke later of nightmares, of the smell of burning wood, the glow of cities beneath them, the silence of the intercom after the bombs dropped. They had won the war, but lost something within themselves. For the Japanese survivors, known as hibakusha, the suffering continued for decades. Radiation sickness, cancer, birth defects, the invisible shadow of the bomb followed them through life. Yet, in their endurance, they became living reminders of the true price of total war. Candle the moment the world held its breath when the first American occupation troops entered Hiroshima, they found a city unrecognizable. Corpses still lay in the riverbeds. The earth glowed faintly in places where heat had fused stone and sand into glass. Trees grew back twisted and pale. Even seasoned soldiers stood in stunned silence. For all the victories and parades, for all the medals and speeches, nothing could erase what they saw there. The B-29 had carried the dawn of a new world, one where mankind's power to destroy had surpassed its power to understand. And yet, from those ashes, something fragile began to grow: peace. The very sky that once rained fire would soon carry relief supplies, food, and medicine. B-29s that once burned cities now dropped leaflets calling for reconstruction. It was as if humanity, horrified by what it had done, was trying to rebuild the world it had just broken. The war was over. But the shadow of the Superfortress would linger, in strategy rooms, in nightmares, in the long silence that follows thunder. Because for the first time in history, mankind had seen its own extinction, and it had come not from the heavens, but from its own hands. When the smoke cleared and the guns went silent, humanity stood in the ruins of its own creation. The world had survived the Second World War, but not unchanged. The B-29 Superfortress, once a symbol of victory, became something far more complex. It was both the angel and the executioner, the machine that had ended one age of war, and begun another defined by fear. Globe showing Europe-Africa a divided piece by 1946, the world's map had been redrawn with invisible lines. The Soviet Union, shaken by America's atomic monopoly, refused to ever be vulnerable again. The United States, triumphant yet uneasy, began a relentless quest to stay one step ahead. The result was the Cold War, a silent conflict of ideologies, paranoia, and unending preparation. And at the center of that cold standoff was the idea born from the B-29, strategic air power. Air bases spread across Europe and Asia like chess pieces. The skies that once belonged to fighter pilots now belonged to nuclear bombers, aircraft built not to fight battles, but to erase entire nations. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction had begun. Gear from Superfortress to Stratofortress, the legacy of the B-29 lived on through its descendants. First came the B-50, an upgraded B-29 with longer range and more power. Then the B-36 Peacemaker, a monster with 6 propellers and 4 jet engines, capable of reaching Moscow without refueling. And finally, in 1955, the B-52 Stratofortress, designed to carry nuclear weapons anywhere on Earth. Each one carried a ghost of the B-29 within it, the same philosophy of air dominance, the same cold logic of total war. Even today, the B-52 still flies, 7 decades later, a reminder that the idea of the Superfortress never truly died. Japan's rebirth. Meanwhile, in the ashes of defeat, Japan began something extraordinary. Under American occupation, the once militarized empire transformed into a democracy. Factories that once built warplanes began producing cars, radios, and cameras. Tokyo, the city once burned by napalm, became the beating heart of a new economic miracle. Within 20 years, Japan was no longer a symbol of destruction but of innovation and resilience. And in a poetic twist of fate, the very nation once bombed by B-29s became a technological ally to the country that built them. The flames that had consumed Japan now fueled its rebirth. Of the survivors speak, but not everyone could leave the past behind. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors, the Hibakusha, began to tell their stories. They spoke of blinding light, of skin burned by invisible fire, of shadows seared into walls where people once stood. Their testimonies shook the conscience of the world. For the first time, the victims of modern warfare had faces, voices, and names. In 1949, the city of Hiroshima built the Peace Memorial Park, not to honor victory, but to mourn humanity's loss. At its center stands the Genbaku Dome, the one building left standing near Ground Zero. It remains untouched, a scar that refuses to fade. And every August 6th, as lanterns drift down the river, the world remembers the day the sky fell. Small airplane. The final flight. The B-29's operational service gradually came to an end in the 1950s. Some were converted into weather reconnaissance planes, others into target drones. A few were preserved in museums, polished, static, silent. But one aircraft in particular, Bockscar, the plane that dropped the Nagasaki bomb, still exists. It sits today in the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Its aluminum skin gleams under museum lights, its nose art untouched, its bomb bay empty. Visitors stand before it in silence, reading the plaque that names its mission. For a moment, the chatter of the world fades, and they understand the weight of what this machine once carried. Not just a bomb, but the future of mankind. Candle legacy of fire and sky. The B-29 Superfortress was born from war, built to destroy, and destined to define an era. It pushed the limits of technology and the limits of conscience. It showed what humanity could achieve, and what it could never undo. Every roar of its engines was a warning disguised as triumph. A reminder that progress without mercy leads only to ruin. And yet, the same hands that built the B-29 also built satellites, space shuttles, and telescopes, machines that no longer look down in anger, but up in wonder. That is the strange legacy of the Superfortress, a machine that carried both death and the seeds of the future. The war ended, but the sky never forgot. The B-29 Superfortress was more than an aircraft. It was a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance and brutality of the human spirit. It rose from the dust of war-torn factories, crafted by men and women who worked through sleepless nights, believing that victory lay in the sky. And it flew into history not just as a machine of war, but as a symbol of how far humanity would go to survive, and how much it might lose along the way. When Japanese pilots first saw it, they laughed. They mocked its size, its speed, its arrogance. But when its shadow stretched across Tokyo, the laughter stopped. Because the Superfortress was not just a bomber, it was a herald of a new age. An age where power no longer belonged to the army that could march the farthest, but to the nation that could reach the highest. An age where war had no front lines, only horizons. For every city that burned beneath its wings, there were lessons written in smoke. That technology without restraint becomes terror. That strength without compassion becomes cruelty. And that victory without wisdom leaves behind only silence. The B-29 carried the world to its most terrifying discovery, the dawn of atomic fire, and from that same fire came a fragile piece that has endured for generations. Today, when we see its silver frame gleaming in a museum or fading in an old black and white reel, we are reminded of what it meant. It was not the weapon that changed the world. It was the will to build it, and the reckoning that followed. Because in the end, the B-29 is not a story about machines. It's a story about mankind, its genius, its pride, its capacity for both creation and destruction. And as the engines fall silent one last time, the echo they leave behind is not one of war, but of warning. That even the mightiest machines are only reflections of the hearts that build them. And that somewhere between fire and flight, lies the true shadow of humanity. Because history is not made by the machines of war, but by the men who dared to command the sky.